This is quite a long presentation because there's a lot to cover and it comes in 3 parts. So I'll get into it right away. So if we look at part 1, which has to do with the committee, we start by appointing the nomination committee, and that has been appointed, and that is currently the immediate past president, Thembi Gwala, the current president, Shamiso Gusha, and a distinguished previous president of Mariswe Toastmasters and distinguished Toastmaster, Enius Chingwe. The nomination committee is currently accepting nominations. It will then present the list of nominations to the club, and we've already set a date for the AGM and the elections. Before we get into the AGM and elections, I need to mention the roles on the committee that we're actually electing. Firstly, at the head of the club, there's the president. Below the president, we have the vice president education. Then we have the vice president membership, the VPPR, the vice president public relations, the treasurer, the secretary, and the sergeant at arms. Also a member of the committee, but not elected, is the immediate past president. Let's go through the roles from the bottom up and look at what each one does. The sergeant at arms, currently Dominique, is responsible for the logistics of the club, things like banners, timing lights, direction signs, which we don't need tonight, looking after the equipment, and the sergeant at arms is the person who sets up the meeting. For online meetings, in many clubs, the sergeant at arms also functions as a Zoom master. The secretary, currently Judith Taylor, manages all the records, correspondence, everything in terms of minutes and documentation. The club treasurer manages the club's finances, pays the bills, keeps a record of the finance. It's very important, particularly at contest time, because a club must be in good standing to compete, and that depends on us having our membership paid up. The VPPR is the person responsible for bringing new members into the club, for talking to the general public and inviting people to join our club. So if we have lots of visitors, that means that the VPPR has done a good job. The vice president membership, the VPM, takes over from the VPPR, and once the guests have arrived at the club, the VPM does everything she can in order to get them to join as members. When they've joined as members, the Vice President Education takes over, and the Vice President Education is responsible for seeing that members progress in their educational journeys in Toastmasters, which is these days Pathways, that they fulfill their projects, that we have members also doing their leadership projects by taking roles in the meetings, and when they're ready, coming onto the committee. There's a lot of work involved, but at Mariswe, we help to split it by having the Toastmaster of the day recruit members for the meetings. Thank you, Didier. Last, we have the president acting as the CEO of the club, responsible for the club's overall operation, presiding at meetings, guiding the club through the Distinguished Club program, making sure that we meet our goals, organizing exco meetings with the club officers, and working with the person they report to higher up in the Toastmasters hierarchy, which is the area director. So it's the president who gives direction to the club. I don't know how to put this well, but the president may not immediately be re-elected as a president again. The president may take another role on the committee, and after they have not been president for a year, they may, if the club so feels, be elected again as president. The immediate past president is then the president from the previous term, and they act as a mentor for the club. They organize mentorship for members. They help guide the president and the committee. They ensure a smooth transition, and they act as a kind of elder statesman, providing advice and counsel as required by the club. The IPP may also act as parliamentarian at meetings. This is a call to action for you to consider which members of the club you want on your committee for the coming Toastmasters year, which starts on the 1st of July, but will be elected sooner. Please put in your nominations. You can do it on WhatsApp or by any other medium that you prefer, to Tembi, Shamiso, or Enius, preferably within the next week so that they've got a chance to get them together, and you'll see why in a moment. Let's now talk about the club elections and the AGM. Quite often, the elections are actually held at the AGM, or annual general meeting. This year, we're in fact holding them separately, which gives us more time to still have speeches, table topics, and other interesting things like evaluations. So this year, we'll be having them separately. The elections will be at the next meeting on Tuesday, the 26th of May, and the AGM itself will be closer to the end of the Toastmasters year on Tuesday, the 9th of June. Please diarise those dates. In each case, within the main meeting, we have what we call a business meeting, which is held under the auspices of a presiding officer, usually the president, and that's scheduled within the regular meeting, but it has an agenda of its own. Talking about the club elections, as I say, generally chaired by the club president, and this is the procedure that is recommended. We'd list all the nominations with President first, VPE, VPM, VPPR, all the way down to Sergeant at Arms. So then you get a full picture of the people who are standing for the committee. Then for each post, the presiding officer names the nominated candidate, starting with the candidate for president, confirms the nominator and seconder, in other words, they've been properly nominated, properly seconded by a member in good standing, which means they've paid their dues. Once that's been done, they will call for nominations from the floor. Again, a nominator and a seconder. Once they have a list of the candidates for the first post, then they ask each candidate if they're willing to stand. If there are multiple candidates, then each candidate gets 3 minutes timed with 2.5, 3 minutes, and 3.5 to cut them off, to address the members and tell them why they should be elected to that post. Then they conduct a secret ballot and announce the winner. If there's only one candidate for a post, then, and this is rather the weird thing, but this is what they do, they ask the Sergeant at Arms to cast a single vote on behalf of the club for the candidate, and then they announce that candidate as the winner, obviously. Meanwhile, the Secretary minutes the results. Now, before we get to the new committee, of course, they then proceed to the next post down, the VPE. A losing candidate for the president could then stand from the floor for VPE if they want to, or they might already have been nominated for multiple posts. And this seems the fairest, because if you start with president, then somebody who's missed president can still pull in for the slot below, and so on, so that they get a better chance of being elected instead of simply standing for one post and then losing out entirely. In some clubs, it's traditional for the posts to go up each year. So the VPE would become the president, the VPM would become the VPE, the VPPR would become the VPM, and so on. There's no reason why this has to take place, and quite a lot in the times of Mariswe's history, people have jumped around. Shamiso, for example, hadn't served on the committee much, and she became president. So it's open for any one of you who would like to stand as president or any post, please do. Then the new committee is invested at the last meeting of the current Toastmasters year or the first meeting of the next year. Some clubs have a special dinner at which this happens. We don't, and probably we're not going to be able to this year, certainly. Let's move on to the annual general meeting. The purpose of the AGM is to receive reports from the club officers on what they've done during the year, particularly the president's report, which might include reports from the other committee members, or they might each give their own, depends on the president. The other particularly important report is the treasurer's financial report for the year, so that we know how they have spent our money, and they would compare what happened against budget. Then the people presenting the reports will take questions. The meeting then approves the report. Particular actions by the committee may be brought to the club for their approval, and anything important should be brought to the club for their approval. And then there may be motions proposed by any members or by members of the committee, debated, voted on, approved, or voted down. That brings us to part 3, meeting procedure. This is a very, very shortened version of a longer thing, and you will find on the web, and I can give you a link to it and a free pass into it, to my presentation on parliamentary procedure. But the idea of parliamentary procedure in a nutshell is to try to balance the interests, often conflicting, between different members in a meeting, provide a smooth procedure, good decorum, and ensure that decisions are made fairly. The majority rules, but the minority has a right to be heard. We base our meetings on Robert's Rules of Order, which has a long and glorious history going back to 1876. And I'm not going to bore you with that. It doesn't have to be. There are many different parliamentary authorities. Often parliaments themselves establish their own rules, but Robert's Rules, being a United States thing and very widespread, is adopted by Toastmasters. Let's give you some definitions. A quorum. Quorum is the minimum number of members needed to be able to run the meeting. At Toastmasters meetings, a quorum is a majority of the members. That means more than 50% of the paid-up members who are active at the time. So we don't count members who have been made inactive, only the active membership. Some motions require more than 50%. Some motions require a 2/3 majority, for example. The Constitution is the governing document of an organization. Toastmasters prescribes for us our Constitution, except that we have an addendum that can be changed. You can find online the standard Toastmasters Constitution, and you can ask Shamiso, who has custody of it, for our Constitution if there are any differences, any addenda to the main Toastmasters constitution. And then bylaws, which are standard rules. We don't really have any bylaws in Mariswe. There are also standing rules, and that would be usually in larger organizations. A motion is a formal proposal for something that is going to be adopted at the meeting. And the presiding officer, as I've mentioned, usually the club president, is the leader of the meeting or chairperson. Now, when a motion is presented, and you might want to present a motion to the AGM to say that you want something done in the club, the first step is that you, as they put it, make a motion or propose the motion. You then require a seconder. It's a good idea to line one up beforehand so that you're not embarrassed by nobody supporting the motion. The presiding officer places the motion before the group. It's then open for debate. It is put to a vote, and the presiding officer announces the result. Let's look at those steps in a bit more detail. To make a motion, the member firstly has to obtain recognition by the chair. In an in-person meeting, they would typically be putting up their hand and waiting for the chair to recognize them. On a Zoom meeting, you could put up your hand using the virtual hand signal, or if we're not terribly formal and you're not muted, then you could unmute yourself and say something like, "Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, may I move a motion?" Once the chair has recognized the member then gets to state their motion. On Zoom, we would typically also ask you to put it in the chat so that everybody can see what the wording of the motion is. So it means it's a good idea if you've typed it out beforehand. Then another member seconds the motion. The presiding officer then puts the motion before the meeting. They state the motion. At this point, minor wording changes can be made if the presiding officer, for example, feels that the motion could be made clearer, but there may be no changes to the substance of the motion. And the presiding officer then says, "It is moved and seconded that," and gives the wording of the motion. "We are now ready for discussion on the motion." The motion now belongs to the meeting, and the proposer and seconder cannot withdraw it or change it. It's now debated. The maker of the motion is entitled to speak first. The presiding officer should alternate people for and against so that there's balance. Officially, everyone gets a first chance to speak. They may get a second chance if nobody else wants to speak and there's time. Except the proposer of the motion usually gets to wrap up before the vote. Stick to the merits when you're speaking, be pertinent. The motion is then put to the vote. The presiding officer says, "Are you ready to vote?" States the motion, says how the vote will be taken, perhaps by simply saying aye or nay. If there's doubt, then perhaps by a poll. Those in favor, those against, those abstaining. And then the results are tallied and announced. If it's a tie, then the motion is lost. The presiding officer will then usually say whose job it is to implement the motion. To recap, 6 steps: make a motion, second it, put the motion to the group, debate, vote, and announce the result. That comes from Parliamentary Procedure in Action in the Success Leadership Series. As I say, if you would like access to my online course of about 4 hours so that you can look at all the details, please ask me and I'll give you a free pass. There are also things like subsidiary motions, and I'll run through them very briefly, privileged motions, and incidental motions. In the course, we give you a whole list like this that you can refer to later. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any questions? Yes.
I had a question. I was asking, do we only see who is nominated at the day of the election? So the list cannot be shared before, so we can see who's running, perhaps?
I know at the last election they didn't make it public beforehand, and I think that was a drawback. I would personally like them to make it public beforehand, but I don't have a definitive from this on the committee. Perhaps if several of us ask the committee to do that, then they might be able to do it. That's one reason for my asking people to put in their nominations within the next week so that the committee has a chance to make it public.
Because Rick was saying last year, the list was not given before, and it was, we after everything was done and we had the list of the nominees, we gave a report and we shared it on WhatsApp before the meeting. Like, I think it was, I don't know if it was a day or two before the meeting, but it was not on the day of the meeting. That is how we did it last time.
Thank you, Tondo.
Okay.
I appreciate the correction.
All right. If the members want us to share the report, we can definitely do that. I think it will be within the interest of the members. If they wanted us to share, we can say maybe end of next week after we've compiled everything, then we can share. At the moment, what we're waiting is for more members to participate in this process. And I'm sure the presentation that Rick did is going to help us, for you members, to choose who you want to serve in your committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Aeneas.